You ever think about how, well, animals make more animals?
Yeah.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you really dig into it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's life, right? The whole cycle of it.
It is, and it gets pretty wild. Like, did you know there's this fish called the bluehead wrasse, hangs out on coral reefs that can actually switch its sex?
No way. Really?
Yeah, it's a female, and then boom, if the social scene calls for it, turns into a male.
That's wild. See, this is the kind of stuff that just grabs you about animal reproduction. It's full of surprises.
Totally, and that's exactly what we're going to do today.
Uh-huh.
A deep dive into all the weird and wonderful ways animals kept the cycle going.
Love it. A deep dive.
We've got this amazing material all about animal reproduction. I mean, it covers everything. We're talking asexual, sexual, the whole nine yards.
We're going all the way down to the hormones, even. Like the stuff that makes it all tick in mammals, us included, of course.
You got it. Today's mission: conquer this chapter. We're breaking down the basics, nuts and bolts, the why behind the how.
The how, the why, the when, it's all connected.
Exactly. We'll cover the whole spectrum of animal techniques. You've got the solo acts, the elaborate mating rituals. I mean, it's a whole world.
A whole world and tons of mind-blowing facts. By the end of this, you'll be able to drop some serious knowledge about the birds and the bees and everything else.
Exactly. And what's great about this material, it's not just surface level stuff. We're getting deep, right into the nitty-gritty.
Absolutely. We're extracting those golden nuggets, those aha moments, and connecting it all back to life itself, the grand scheme of things.
I love it. So looking at our source material, it's laid out really well: asexual and sexual reproduction, fertilization, then those specialized organs, hormonal signals, and then the development in placental mammals.
Sounds good to me. Let's dive in.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, let's kick things off with the two major ways animals reproduce: asexual and sexual.
Right. And maybe starting with asexual reproduction, the original one-person show.
Huh. I like that.
Mm-hmm.
So no need for a partner, no egg and sperm fusion.
Exactly. It's basically like hitting copy-paste on a cell, creating a genetically identical replica. It all comes down to mitotic cell division.
So walk me through some of the ways they pull this off.
You got it. We've got budding, like in those incredible stony coral reefs. Think about it, it's not just one coral making another.
Right. It's how these massive colonies are formed.
Precisely. Thousands of connected individuals all stemming from a single original. Pretty amazing when you think about it, a whole underwater city essentially built on clones.
It really shows how powerful asexual reproduction can be. You get these vast, interconnected populations, all from one blueprint. Then there's fission, right?
Yep. This one's straight to the point.
Yeah.
The parent organism just splits, divides itself into two more or less identical individuals. You see this in some simple invertebrates. Bam, just like that, two new beings.
Like hitting a cosmic reset button, doubling your population, and then there's fragmentation and regeneration.
Yes. This one always feels a bit sci-fi.
I know, right? Like you break a creature into pieces and poof, each piece can grow into a whole new organism, as long as the pieces are big enough and have the right stuff.
It really highlights the incredible regenerative abilities of some species.
It does. Like annelid worms are masters at this. But it's also common in corals and sponges, even some tunicates. It's like something out of a superhero movie.
The potential within those fragments is amazing. To develop into a fully functioning organism, it's really a testament to their developmental flexibility.
Absolutely. All right, let's move on to parthenogenesis. This one's always fascinating.
Parthenogenesis, the virgin birth, essentially. We're talking about an egg developing without any fertilization from sperm. And while it sounds rare, it's actually a pretty successful strategy in certain corners of the animal kingdom.
Oh, for sure. Like, think about bees, wasps, ants. This is how they make the males, the drones, unfertilized eggs. The females, the worker bees, and the queen, they come from fertilized eggs.
It's a fascinating way to structure a whole society based on the way they reproduce. And it's not just limited to insects either.
Right. We're seeing parthenogenesis in some vertebrates, too.
Ugh.
Komodo dragons, some shark species like hammerheads and zebra sharks, even sawfish. And it often seems to happen when females are on their own, isolated from males.
That's right. It's like a backup plan, an insurance policy for the species. If you can't find a mate, well, you still have a chance to pass on your genes.
Makes sense. It's like, okay, I can do this myself.
Exactly. And there was this interesting study on sawfish in Florida. They found offspring with only the mother's genes.
Wow, parthenogenesis happening in the wild.
Yep. And it makes you think about the evolutionary pressures that drive these kinds of adaptations. In low population densities, this ability to reproduce solo could be the key to survival.
Absolutely. It's all about adapting to the environment, finding a way to keep those genes flowing.
Now, speaking of genes, we've talked about the solo act, but let's move on to the more traditional approach, sexual reproduction.
All right, the classic sperm meets egg scenario.
Exactly. And the basics are pretty straightforward. Two haploid gametes, the sperm and the egg, fuse together to form a diploid zygote.
Quick reminder for our listeners. Haploid means they each have half the usual amount of genetic information, and diploid means they have the full set after fusing.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And what's important here is that the gametes themselves are pretty different. The egg, it's large, packed with nutrients, and it's not moving around. The sperm, it's small, basically just DNA with a tail, and its whole purpose is to move, to find that egg.
So you've got the classic male and female roles, but nature loves to throw us a curveball sometimes, doesn't it?
Oh, for sure. And that's where we get to hermaphrodism.
The ultimate double-duty reproductive strategy.
Exactly. One individual producing both male and female gametes, it's pretty common, especially in animals that are stuck in one place, like barnacles, or those that burrow, like clams.
Or even some parasites. Makes sense, though. If you can't go looking for a mate, why not have both sets of equipment?
Right. Turns every encounter into a potential reproductive opportunity. And some hermaphrodites can even self-fertilize, which is incredibly efficient.
Although it does make you wonder about the benefits of mixing genes, which is usually the whole point of sexual reproduction, right?
It does raise some interesting questions about the evolutionary trade-offs. And then on top of that, you've got sex reversal.
Like our bluehead wrasse friend.
Exactly. In some species, individuals can switch sex during their lifetime. It all comes down to what gives them the best chance of reproductive success.
Yeah, like the wrasse. The biggest female in the group, if the male's gone, she can step up and become the male. Bigger, stronger, better chance to protect a whole harem of females.
Makes perfect sense in their social structure. And then you've got oysters doing the opposite, starting male and then switching to female when they're larger. It all comes down to maximizing egg production.
Bigger female, more eggs, higher chance of passing on those genes. So it's really all about playing the evolutionary game, maximizing your reproductive potential. Now, when it comes to reproduction, it's not just about how, but also when.
Oh, absolutely. Timing is crucial. Most animals don't just reproduce year-round. They've got reproductive cycles, often linked to the seasons.
Makes perfect sense. You want your offspring to enter the world when resources are plentiful and the conditions are good. It's all about survival.
Right. And those cycles are finely tuned by hormones and environmental cues. Take ewes, for example. Their cycle's timed by changes in daylight, ovulations around the middle, and lambs are born in spring.
When there's plenty of fresh grass for mom to eat and for the lambs to grow. But here's the thing, these cycles are delicate. They can be thrown off by things like climate change.
It's true. We're seeing it with the Greenland caribou, for example. Warmer springs mean plants sprout earlier, but the caribou migration is tied to daylight hours, so they're arriving at their calving grounds too late.
And the best food's already gone, so the mothers aren't as well nourished, and the calves have lower survival rates. It's a powerful example of how interconnected these systems are and how even small changes can have big impacts.
It is. And it's not just large mammals either. Even tiny creatures like water fleas Daphnia have these amazing cyclical behaviors. When conditions are good, they go for asexual reproduction, maximizing their numbers quickly.
But when things get tough, food's scarce, the pond's drying up, they switch to sexual reproduction.
Exactly. It's about generating genetic diversity, increasing the odds that at least some offspring will have the traits needed to survive those changes.
It's like hedging your bets, spreading the risk. Then there's the curious case of the parthenogenetic lizards, Aspidoscelis uniparens, all females, reproducing asexually. But here's the kicker. They still do this whole courtship and mating-like ritual, even though they don't need a male to reproduce.
It's a fascinating example of a behavioral holdover from their evolutionary past. They don't need sperm, but they still need those hormonal signals triggered by these interactions for optimal reproductive output.
So one female acts like the female before ovulation, driven by high estradiol, and the other mimics the male. Then, after ovulation, when the first female's progesterone levels rise, she switches to acting more like the male.
And get this, those lizards that engage in this ritual lay more eggs than isolated ones.
It's like they've got this ingrained dance they need to do, even without a partner, for the main event. So we've talked about asexual and sexual reproduction, all these different strategies. But here's a question that bugs me. If asexual reproduction is so efficient, why even bother with sex?
That's a fundamental question in evolutionary biology, and it's not an easy one to answer. There's this concept called the twofold cost of sex.
Lay it on me.
Basically, in sexual reproduction, only half the offspring are females who can then go on to reproduce. The other half are males.
Whereas with asexual reproduction, every offspring is a female, capable of having more offspring. So on the surface, it seems like asexual reproduction should win out, right?
You'd think so, but clearly that's not what happened. Sexual reproduction is still incredibly common and successful, which means that there must be some serious advantages to outweigh that cost.
Okay, so what's the big payoff?
Well, the leading theories mostly revolve around genetic diversity. Sexual reproduction, with its mixing and matching of genes during meiosis and fertilization, generates offspring with unique combinations of genes. And that's incredibly valuable in a changing environment.
So when faced with challenges like new diseases, changing climates, or anything unpredictable, some of your offspring might have just the right combination of genes to survive and thrive.
Exactly. Asexual reproduction is great in stable environments, where a winning set of genes can just be copied over and over. But in a dynamic world, that lack of variation can be a real liability. Plus, sexual reproduction might also speed up adaptation, letting beneficial gene combinations come together more quickly.
And maybe even helping to purge harmful mutations from a population.
It's like variety is the spice of life, but it's also, apparently, the key to long-term evolutionary success.
Okay, so we've talked about the why of sex, the different strategies. Now let's get into the actual process of fertilization, that moment of truth when sperm and egg come together.
All right, let's break it down. Fertilization can happen in two main ways, externally or internally. External fertilization is pretty straightforward. The female releases her eggs into the environment, usually water, and the male releases his sperm right near them.
Like those mass coral spawning events you see in nature documentaries. Or frogs in a pond releasing clouds of eggs and sperm.
Exactly, and for this to work, you need a moist environment. Those gametes are delicate, they dry out easily, and the sperm need water to swim.
Makes sense. But how do they make sure the sperm and eggs are released at the same time? It's like a synchronized dance, right?
Oh, yeah. Sometimes they use pheromones, chemical signals that trigger spawning in nearby individuals. Other times, it's environmental cues. Temperature changes, day length, even the phases of the moon.
Like the Pololo worm, right? They spawn on a specific night linked to both the season and the lunar cycle.
Precisely. And even with external fertilization, you often see these elaborate courtship rituals. They're not just randomly releasing their gametes.
Right, they're making sure they're in the right place at the right time. It's all about maximizing the chances of fertilization. Now, what about internal fertilization?
Internal fertilization is all about bringing those gametes together inside the female's reproductive tract. It's the adaptation that allowed animals to colonize land, protecting those precious gametes from drying out.
But it also means you need more complex reproductive systems, both in the male and the female, right?
Exactly. And some form of cooperative behavior, usually copulation, to get those sperm where they need to go.
So you need the right equipment and the right moves. And often, that means the male has a copulatory organ, like a penis, to deliver the sperm. And the female might have specialized structures to store sperm.
Right, like spermathecae in insects. It's like an internal sperm bank.
So they can mate, store the sperm, and then fertilize their eggs later, when the timing's right. And in all this, pheromones still play a role, right? Sending those chemical signals to attract potential mates.
They do. Pheromones are fascinating. They're like a chemical language influencing behavior and physiology. And they can be incredibly powerful, especially for animals that are spread out, like many insects. It's how they find each other in the vastness of the world.
So whether fertilization happens internally or externally, the ultimate goal is the same: to ensure the survival of those offspring. Are there differences in how that plays out?
Generally speaking, with internal fertilization, you see fewer gametes produced overall, but the survival rate of the zygotes is much higher.
Makes sense. Those eggs are protected inside the female's body, shielded from predators and harsh conditions.
Exactly. And internal fertilization often goes hand in hand with greater parental care, too.
Like birds building nests and incubating their eggs, or mammals nursing their young.
Precisely. And even some invertebrates, like the giant water bug, the male carries the eggs on his back, protecting them, aerating them. It's incredible.
Talk about dedicated dads. And then you have the different strategies for internal embryonic development itself.
Right. Marsupials, they have a short gestation period inside the mother, and then the offspring continue to develop in a pouch. Eutherian mammals, like us, the embryo develops fully inside the uterus, nourished by the placenta.
And even some fish and sharks have evolved internal development. It's amazing to see the diversity of ways animals have solved this challenge of protecting their offspring, giving them the best chance at survival.
It really is. And as we move further along the reproductive journey, we see that mating itself isn't always a simple one-on-one affair.
No, it rarely is. Often you've got competition among males for access to females, and different mating systems at play, like monogamy, where one male and one female pair bond, which seems pretty rare, especially among mammals.
It is. And even when a male does mate with a female, there are often mechanisms at play to enhance his reproductive success with her and maybe even reduce the chances she'll mate with someone else later.
Like some male insects, they transfer secretions along with their sperm that make the female less receptive to other males. Talk about playing dirty.
It's all about maximizing your chances in the reproductive game. And females aren't just passive players either. That fruit fly experiment, remember?
Oh, yeah. The females can actually influence which sperm fertilizes their eggs. Like they could potentially expel sperm from previous matings.
It's a fascinating area of research revealing the complexities of sperm competition and cryptic female choice. The females have more agency than we might have thought.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered the different ways to reproduce, how fertilization happens. Let's zoom in on the hardware, the reproductive organs themselves.
These are the structures responsible for producing, transporting, all that good stuff. Let's start with the human male reproductive anatomy. Externally, you've got the scrotum and the penis.
The scrotum, that pouch of skin, it's crucial for temperature regulation. Sperm production needs things a bit cooler than core body temperature.
Exactly. And then the testes themselves, those are the primary male reproductive organs. Sperm production happens in tiny tubes called seminiferous tubules, and they also produce testosterone, the main male sex hormone.
And the sperm, they go on a journey, right? From the seminiferous tubules, they move to the epididymis, where they mature and gain the ability to swim. Then it's the vastus the ejaculatory duct, and finally they exit through the urethra, which runs through the penis.
Precisely. And the penis itself, it has erectile tissue that becomes engorged with blood during arousal, allowing for penetration and sperm delivery. It's fascinating how the nervous system, the blood vessels, and the hormones all work together for erection and ejaculation.
It's a beautifully coordinated system. And then you've got the accessory glands, the seminal vesicles, the prostate gland, and the bulbourethral glands. They all contribute essential components to the semen.
Right. Things like fructose to give the sperm energy, fluids for motility, enzymes for coagulation and liquefaction. It's all about creating the optimal environment for those sperm to survive and make their journey.
And that pre-ejaculatory fluid from the bulbourethral glands, that can actually contain some sperm too.
Which is why the withdrawal method isn't the most reliable form of contraception.
Good point. Now, what about the female reproductive anatomy?
Okay, so externally you've got the clitoris, which, like the penis, has erectile tissue and is highly sensitive to stimulation. And the labia majora and labia minora, which are folds of skin protecting the openings of the vagina and the urethra.
And during arousal, all those tissues become engorged with blood, and there's lubricating mucus secreted from glands.
Right. And internally, you've got the ovaries, the primary female reproductive organs, where the eggs, or oocytes, are produced.
And those oocytes develop within follicles, and then during ovulation, one is released and travels down the oviduct, also known as the fallopian tube, towards the uterus.
And fertilization typically happens in the oviduct. Tiny hair-like structures called cilia help to move the egg along.
And the uterus itself, that's where a fertilized egg implants and develops. It has an inner lining called the endometrium, which is crucial for pregnancy. And the lower narrow end of the uterus is the cervix, which opens into the vagina.
The vagina serves as the receptacle for sperm during intercourse and as the birth canal during childbirth. And of course, we can't forget the mammary glands responsible for milk production.
So we've got the human reproductive anatomy down. What about insects? How do their systems compare?
Taking the fruit fly as a common example, males have tests for sperm production, a vas deferens for transport, seminal vesicles, accessory glands, and an ejaculatory duct.
And their penis has claspers to help them hold on to the female during mating. The females, they have ovaries for egg production, oviducts, a uterus for storing and developing fertilized eggs, and spermathecae for storing sperm.
Exactly. So the basic functions are similar, but the structures themselves are adapted to their specific needs and evolutionary history. And of course, there's even more variation when you look across all vertebrates.
Right. Some have a uterus divided into two chambers, like rabbits, and many non-mammalian vertebrates have a cloaca, which is a single opening for the digestive, excretory, and reproductive systems.
And those with a cloaca, they often lack a well-developed penis, instead using an inversion of the cloaca to release sperm. Mammals, on the other hand, usually have separate openings for everything.
So much diversity in the animal world. It's
Yes.
amazing. Okay, we've got the organs down. Now let's talk about how those gametes, the sperm and egg, are actually produced. Gametogenesis, right?
Right. This is the process of making haploid gametes from diploid cells through meiosis. It differs in males and females, so we can break it down separately.
Sounds good. Let's start with sperm production, spermatogenesis.
This takes place in the testes, within the seminiferous tubules. It's a continuous process, taking about 7 weeks for a single sperm to fully develop. It all starts with stem cells called spermatogonia.
And those spermatogonia, they undergo mitosis, regular cell division, to produce more spermatogonia. But then some of those daughter cells enter meiosis, that special type of cell division that has the number of chromosomes.
Exactly. And the result is 4 haploid cells called spermatids.
Then those spermatids undergo some final transformations to become those familiar, streamlined sperm cells, with a head containing the DNA and enzymes, a midpiece packed with mitochondria for energy, and a tail for swimming. And all along the way, they're being supported and nourished by Sertoli cells within the seminiferous tubules.
Right. Once they're formed, they move into the epididymis, where they finish maturing and gain their swimming skills. Now, oogenesis, the production of eggs in females, that's a different story.
Yeah, it's a much longer and more complex process. It actually starts in the female embryo.
That's right. You have these precursor cells called oogonia that multiply through mitosis and then enter meiosis, but then they pause, they arrest in prophase of meiosis before birth.
And those arrested cells are now called primary oocytes. They're housed within follicles in the ovaries, and a female is born with all the primary oocytes she'll ever have.
Which is a lot, by the way, somewhere between 1 and 2 million, but only a few hundred will actually mature and be ovulated during her reproductive lifespan.
So starting at puberty, under the influence of FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone, some of those follicles start growing each month. Usually only one reaches full maturity. And inside that mature follicle, the primary oocyte completes meiosis the first, resulting in a secondary oocyte and a polar body that typically degenerates.
And that secondary oocyte starts meiosis the second, but it stops again, this time at metaphase 2, and it stays arrested there until fertilization happens.
So ovulation is the release of that secondary oocyte from the mature follicle. And it only completes meiosis second if a sperm actually penetrates it. And there's another key difference: the way the cytoplasm divides during those meiotic divisions. It's unequal, resulting in one large nutrient-rich egg cell and those smaller polar bodies that don't really do anything.
Exactly. So in spermatogenesis, you get 4 equal-sized sperm from each precursor cell. But in oogenesis, it's all about making one big, healthy egg.
Makes sense. And oogenesis is cyclical, with long interruptions, and it stops entirely at menopause. Unlike spermatogenesis, which is pretty much continuous in males.
Yeah.
So different timelines, different outcomes. But both processes are essential for creating those haploid gametes ready for fertilization.
And it's all orchestrated by hormones, right? The ultimate puppet masters of reproduction.
Those hormones control everything: gamete production, cycles, the whole shebang. It's a complex system involving the hypothalamus in the brain, the anterior pituitary gland and the gonads, the testes in males, and the ovaries in females.
So walk us through it. All right, so the hypothalamus, it releases gonadotropin-releasing hormone, GnRH.
And GnRH acts on the anterior pituitary, telling it to release 2 other hormones: follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH. And those are the gonadotropins, the ones that directly target the gonads.
Precisely. So FSH and LH act on the testes in males, supporting sperm production and the production of androgens like testosterone. And in females, FSH and LH stimulate follicle development in the ovaries, ovulation, and the production of estrogens like estradiol and progesterone.
Now, it's important to remember, all 3 types of sex hormones are present in both males and females, but the levels are very different.
Oh, yeah. Testosterone is much higher in males, while estradiol and progesterone are higher in females. And these sex hormones, they're not just about the act of reproduction itself.
Right, they're also involved in development, shaping those sex characteristics.
Exactly. In male embryos, testosterone and other androgens direct the development of the primary sex characteristics, like the seminal vesicles, the ducts that carry sperm, and the external genitalia. There was this classic experiment by Jost on rabbits where they removed the gonads early on, and it prevented the formation of those male structures, showing how crucial those hormones are.
And then at puberty, There's a surge in those sex hormones, triggering the development of the secondary sex characteristics.
Right, the things that distinguish males and females but aren't directly involved in reproduction, like a deeper voice, facial hair in males, breast development in females, all those changes.
And this is also where we touch on biological sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation.
Right, those are important distinctions to make. Biological sex is typically assigned at birth based on physical characteristics, including chromosomes and genitalia. The SRY gene on the Y chromosome, that's the big one for determining testis development. And it's important to recognize that there are intersex conditions where individuals have combinations of chromosomes or hormonal profiles that don't fit neatly into male or female categories.
Absolutely. Gender identity, on the other hand, is that internal sense of being male, female, both, neither, or somewhere else on the spectrum. It's about how you see yourself. And then sexual orientation, that's about who you're attracted to, romantically, emotionally, or sexually.
It's all about recognizing the diversity of human experience beyond those traditional binary categories. Now back to those hormones. Let's focus on how they regulate reproduction in males.
Okay, break it down.
So FSH, it mainly acts on the Sertoli cells in the seminiferous tubules, stimulating them to nourish the developing sperm cells. LH, on the other hand, it acts on the Leydig cells, which are between the seminiferous tubules, stimulating them to produce testosterone.
And that testosterone then helps drive spermatogenesis, the whole sperm production process.
Exactly. And there are these negative feedback loops that keep everything in check. High testosterone levels, they inhibit the release of GnRH from the hypothalamus, which then reduces FSH and LH secretion from the pituitary.
So it's like a thermostat, making sure the levels stay within a certain range. And the Sertoli cells also produce inhibin, which specifically inhibits FSH.
It's all about maintaining that balance, that delicate hormonal equilibrium.
Now, what about in females? The hormonal control there seems even more intricate.
It is. You've got these two interconnected cycles, the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle, also known as the menstrual cycle.
So the ovarian cycle, that's all about follicle development and ovulation. The uterine cycle, that's about the thickening and shedding of the endometrium, the lining of the uterus.
Exactly. And those cycles are synchronized by those fluctuating hormone levels. It all starts with GnRH from the hypothalamus, stimulating the pituitary to release FSH and LH.
And those trigger the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. FSH stimulates follicle growth, and the follicles start producing estradiol. At first, those estradiol levels are low, and that actually inhibits FSH and LH release.
Right, it's negative feedback, keeping those levels in check. But then, as one follicle becomes dominant and estradiol production ramps up, it switches to positive feedback, causing that big surge in LH around day 14.
The LH surge, that's what triggers ovulation, the release of that secondary oocyte from the mature follicle.
Exactly. Then we enter the luteal phase. The ruptured follicle transforms into the corpus luteum under the influence of LH. And the corpus luteum starts churning out progesterone and estradiol.
And those high levels, they inhibit GnRH, FSH, and LH, preventing the development of new follicles and preparing the uterus for a potential pregnancy.
Right. If there's no fertilization and implantation, the corpus luteum degenerates, hormone levels drop, and that removes the brake on the hypothalamus and pituitary, letting FSH rise again and kick off a new cycle.
It's like a finely choreographed dance of hormones, preparing the body for the possibility of new life.
It is. And the uterine cycle runs in parallel. During the follicular phase, estradiol stimulates the thickening of the endometrium. Then, after ovulation, in the luteal phase, progesterone further develops the endometrium, getting it ready for implantation.
And if implantation doesn't happen, those hormone levels drop and the endometrium sheds. That's menstruation.
Precisely. It's all beautifully coordinated. But sometimes things can go wrong, like with endometriosis, where uterine tissue grows outside the uterus and still responds to those hormones, causing pain and bleeding.
And eventually there's menopause, when ovulation and menstruation stop altogether. The ovaries become less responsive to FSH and LH, and estradiol levels plummet.
It's a natural part of aging, but there are interesting evolutionary theories about why it might have evolved, like the grandmother hypothesis, suggesting it allows women to focus their energy on supporting existing grandchildren.
Fascinating. It's also worth mentioning the difference between menstrual cycles, where the endometrium is shed, and estrous cycles, which most other mammals have.
Right. In estrous cycles, the endometrium is reabsorbed if there's no pregnancy, and sexual receptivity is often limited to a short period around ovulation called estrus, or heat. And the timing and frequency of estrous cycles can vary a lot between species.
So much variation in the animal world. It's incredible. And finally, let's touch on the human sexual response. It follows a fairly similar pattern in males and females, despite the anatomical differences.
Right. 4 phases: excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. And both involve physiological changes like vasocongestion, where tissues become engorged with blood, and myotonia, increased muscle tension.
And it's all intertwined with psychological factors, too. The shared pattern really highlights the similarities in our physiological responses to sexual stimulation, regardless of sex.
It's a reminder of our shared evolutionary history and the common origins of many of our reproductive structures. Okay, so we've covered cycles, hormones, the whole reproductive symphony.
Time for the grand finale, embryonic development in placental mammals.
Let's do it. It all starts with conception, fertilization, that magical moment when a sperm fuses with a mature oocyte. And it usually happens in the oviduct.
And think about it, it's hundreds of millions of sperm in a typical ejaculate, all vying for that one egg. It's like a microscopic race to the finish line.
It is. After ejaculation, the semen actually coagulates and then liquefies, which helps the sperm on their journey. And once a sperm does penetrate the egg, the fertilized egg, now a zygote, starts dividing rapidly as it travels down the oviduct.
By about day 4, it's a blastocyst, a ball of cells with a fluid-filled cavity. And around day 7, it implants in the endometrium, the lining of the uterus. That's when pregnancy or gestation officially begins.
Human pregnancy, it averages about 266 days from fertilization, which is clinically calculated as 40 weeks from the first day of the woman's last menstrual period. And we divide that gestation period into 3 trimesters.
So the first trimester, that's a period of intense development, right? The embryo starts secreting HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, which is like LH, keeping the corpus luteum alive so it keeps producing progesterone and estrogen.
Exactly. That's what early pregnancy tests detect, those high HCG levels. At first, the embryo gets its nutrients directly from the endometrium, but pretty quickly, the trophoblast, the outer layer of the blastocyst, starts forming the placenta.
The placenta, that's the lifeline between the mother and the